Hi, everyone. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the ant of the self because I think there is some subtlety in the story that's kind of getting overlooked. And I think it's easy to do so because it is pretty subtle, and Packer weaves it in through the first person narrator, which makes it even more difficult to recognize. Um, so the reason that I suggested the implicit bias test is to help us understand a little bit about what's going on with Spurgeon, and to get us to start thinking about what his implicit biases are and from where they come, what's influenced them. Um, on the surface, the story is about a son who's having some problems with a difficult father and trying to find his place in the world. And I think justifiably, he's got some frustration with his father. There's some signs of physical abuse or emotional abuse, definitely emotional abuse, in the way that Spurgeon's mother has talked about the father. And we also see a little bit of kind of verbal abuse from his father in the car, calling him names and whatnot. Um, but I think there's more to the story than that. I think there's also some responsibility that lies with Spurgeon that is not as easy to recognize, but I think there's some clues in the text that suggest um, that there's more to his feelings about his father than he lets on. So I want to talk about that a little bit today, just to dig into the story more, because again, on the surface it says one thing, but I think there's more to it. So if we look at the way that Spurgeon thinks about his father, as well as the way that he thinks about and describes the people at the Million Man March, as well as the people at the bar, I think it starts to let us into his mind a little bit more and see some of the things that he can't see. And that's the thing about implicit bias, right? And a lot of times is in response to that implicit bias test that people take online, there's some resistance because people think, well, I'm not really that way. I know myself better than that. But that's the thing about implicit bias is we don't recognize it. We don't see it. It's unconscious. So we really don't know ourselves as much as we think we do. And our unconscious bias has been informed by what we've seen in the world and what we've been around. And everybody has implicit bias that's been influenced by their kind of narrow way of seeing the world. We only see the world through a lens, and we can't be all knowing. We can't see everything. So what we see is what informs the way we think the world is and should be. So first, I want to point out some things that stand out in the story in terms of Spurgeon's thinking about his father. And keep in mind, the first person narrator is a place where we can have what's called an unreliable narrator, one that doesn't tell us the complete truth, because they are intentionally withholding some things, or they just don't see the complete truth themselves. And I think there's a little bit of both in this story. For example, a place where I think Spurgeon isn't letting on his true feelings, even though he realizes them, is when he's looking into the sun and he's saying that it's so bright that it brings tears to his eyes, and he's blaming it on the sun. Uh, but I think if we think about what's really happening in that scene, there's more to that. He feels frustrated and he feels like he doesn't fit in, and he's upset with his father, and I think he's crying for a much different reason there, not the sun being in his eyes. But some of the places where we see it more subconsciously in him and kind of revealed through the text is when he's describing his father. So I'm going to point out some examples from the story where his unreliability is given to us. He interprets his father's actions in one way, and there's possibility that his father is more genuine and more um, um, concerned with him, and than Spurgeon lets on. So the first place is we see on the very first page of the story, page 82, where he talks about, I just try to get my father back across the river to his place in Indiana. And it's interesting to me here that the term his place is used, not his home or his house or where he lives, but his place. So Spurgeon sees things in a lot of kind of a hierarchical order, as we'll see as we continue to go through this. On the next page, 83, we see him describe the Black Panther Party, the quote, the brothers, and how they raked their globes of hair with black-fisted afro picks that then left them stuck there like javelins. So this is the first time we see a weapon being used in a description of a black man, and we see other examples of this here in a little while. On the next page, we see at the top of the page, on page 84, instead, out of the blue, voice almost pure, he says, "Is that my old dress jacket? I loved that thing." So we can see here that the almost pure inflection in the voice is maybe suggesting that Ray Bivens is genuinely proud that his son would wear his jacket. He's looking for some kind of connection with his son, and this makes him proud that his son is wearing something of his. But then Spurgeon replies, "It's not yours. Mama bought it. I needed a blazer for the debate." The words come out chilly, but I don't say anything else to warm them up. On the next page, on page 85, we see that his father did insist on partial custody. After the divorce, he insisted on partial custody. So this insistence, I think, lets us in on a little bit more than, he probably could have not insisted on partial custody, right? He could have chosen to only see him occasionally. But this insistence, I think, does lead to us to think about how Ray Bivens does have some good intentions with his son. Now, does he carry those out? Well, that's a different story, right? We see that when he does go to visit his father, they don't really do much. They sit around watching TV while his father falls asleep. On the next page, we see Ray Bivens trying to give him some advice about investments. So again, something he has good intentions here. He's trying to teach his son something, but he doesn't have the same amount of knowledge that Spurgeon has. And then on the next page, after Ray talks about you won't hear this advice from an accountant, Spurgeon corrects him and says it's not an accountant, it's a stockbroker. This is one of the first examples where we see Spurgeon pointing out the flaw in somebody else's logic or their word choice or their actions. He likes to show his superiority to others. We'll see some other examples of that in a little while. Flipping ahead, when we get to the Million Man March, I wanted to point out some terms that start to help us see Spurgeon's implicit bias when it comes to black and African American men. So let me find these. Okay, so on page 98, we arrive at the Million Man March. Some of the things that stood out to me here is, and imagine a white person saying this. I think it might stand out to you more if this were the case. But maybe we don't recognize it as much on the first read because it is an African American who is saying these things about other African American men. He talks about the bass so heavy that it hurts your heart. He says that everything has an early morning smell to it. And again, I'm on page 98, cold and wet with dew, but already thousands have marked their territory with portable chairs and signs. We think about marked their territory, what that's usually used in reference to. You can easily imagine this phrase being used with animals. Right? It's probably the most common place we hear it. Animals mark their territory. On the next page, we see, and we see this throughout the story, the idea of how they are all speaking in passwords that Spurgeon doesn't understand. So this otherness. At the bottom of 99, in describing the the Nation of Islam. He says the fruit of Islam phalanx behind him applauds so violently that their clapping resembles some sort of martial art. So here we see a violence being associated with black men. We saw earlier in the story with the javelin comment. On the next page, we see Spurgeon say, "It occurs to me I can stay here on the sidelines for the entire march." So we see him not being comfortable mixing in with the rest of the marchers. A little bit farther down, he says, "I look at the screen and see him clasping hands." This is talking about Jesse Jackson with Farrakhan, but he doesn't do much more than that. If anything, I'd like the chance to hear him speak in person, purely for speech and debate purposes. So we see that he wants to hear Jesse Jackson speak for what could be considered selfish reasons, to improve his own debate and speech, not to actually hear the content of the message. So you have to ask yourself, I think, why is it that Spurgeon doesn't care about the content of the message? Does he consider it beneath him? On the next page, we see another speaker, and Spurgeon's talking about, "At first it sounds like what everyone else has been saying, breaking a cardinal rule of public speaking. One should reiterate, not regurgitate." So here again, Spurgeon is showing his supremacy when it comes to having some kind of knowledge that other people don't have in critiquing the speech. Farther down on the page, "I look for someone to save me from this man." So someone is asking him to feel the power of the message, and Spurgeon wants to be saved from this man. On the next page, page 103, again talking about the Nation of Islam. They are moving in the form of crisp, gray-suited men wearing stern looks and prison muscles. So far we've seen him describe the men at the march as, in terms of animals, marking their territory, referencing violence, clapping so violently it's like a martial art. Here we see a reference to prison muscles. So a lot of the common stereotypes of black men are being seen here and coming through Spurgeon, who seems to have those same stereotypes in himself. A little bit lower on the page, we see him correcting somebody about the difference between atonement and apology. Again, showing some kind of form of supremacy. I know better than you know. He says atoning for one's wrongs is different from apologizing. One involves words, the other's action. And then shortly after this is where we see the scene about the sun in his eyes being so hot I feel like crying. And again, I think there's more to it than that. He has to kind of try to confirm that what he's saying is right. He says, "What I'm saying is right and true, period, good and important, period, but I can feel myself getting flustered." And I can't help but wonder if he's getting flustered because maybe what he's saying isn't so right and true. Maybe there's more to it than that.